let me tell you a story. Actually, let me tell you four. Four names, once carved into the heights of fame, now whispered with a strange kind of reverence, not for what they achieved, but for what they lost. Fame, fortune, direction, even themselves. These are not fairy tales. They are cautionary epics. They are quiet tragedies in golden wrapping. And somewhere in them, if you listen closely, you might just hear the echo of your own fears, or the map to your own resilience. So get comfortable. Maybe you're lying in bed, or curled into your favorite chair. Maybe your eyes are already growing heavy. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Tell me in the comments. I'm always curious who's drifting off to history with me in the quiet hours of the night. Now then, our first story. It begins not with scandal, nor with violence, but with something far more fragile. Kindness. Because our first subject was never the loudest in the room, never the wildest, but perhaps, in his own way, he was the most beloved. This is the rise and fall, and quiet rise again, of Brendan Fraser. If you were around in the 1990s or early 2000s, you remember him. He had that certain look, not intimidating, not smug but open, earnest. A face you could trust. Shoulders built for ancient armor or jungle vines, and eyes that always seemed to be apologizing for being so handsome. Brendan Fraser was what some in Hollywood quietly call too good for it. Too kind, too soft-spoken, too unguarded, in a world where sharp teeth hide behind white smiles. But for a time, he was everywhere. His breakout came in 1992 with Encino Man, a ridiculous little comedy about a frozen caveman thawed out in the modern world. Silly? Absolutely. But Fraser gave the role something rare. He made it human. And that's what studios saw. A man who could be funny without being cruel, strong without being menacing, heroic without being arrogant. From there, he became a genre unto himself. In George of the Jungle, he swung through the trees in little more than a loincloth and sincerity, and somehow made it charming. Kids loved him. Parents laughed with him. And Hollywood took notice. Then came The Mummy. Oh, The Mummy. A film that should have been forgettable. A CGI-laden throwback to adventure flicks of the past. And yet, it became an instant classic. Not because of its effects. Not because of its plot. But because of him. Fraser's Rick O'Connell was everything Indiana Jones fans had missed. Roguish but kind, funny but capable, brave but terrified in all the right moments. He ran from mummies, traded sarcastic lines, and somehow made even the most absurd moments feel grounded. By the early 2000s, Brendan Fraser was a household name. Not in the dramatic sense, not the way DiCaprio was, or Pitt, but in a quieter, more universal way. He was the guy everyone liked. The one your mom, your little brother, and your high school crush all agreed on. And in Hollywood, that kind of broad appeal is a rare and fragile thing. He starred in family-friendly films like Bedazzled and Looney Tunes, Back in Action, dipped his toes in Oscar fare like Gods and Monsters, and even gave a heartbreaking turn in The Quiet American. He was working constantly. Always present. Always smiling. But behind that smile, things were beginning to crack. You wouldn't have known it from the interviews or red carpets. Fraser was professional to the end. Always gracious. Always kind. But his body was breaking. In the midst of all those action roles, the stunts, the falls, the constant physical demand, Fraser had been doing much of his own stunt work. And it came at a cost. He later revealed that he had undergone multiple surgeries over the years. A partial knee replacement, vocal cord repair, and numerous back surgeries. At one point, he said he felt like he was held together with tape and ice. But worse than the pain was the invisibility. Hollywood, as it often does, didn't want to see weakness. It didn't want a hero who limped, or aged, or hurt. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the phone stopped ringing. Fraser, once a reliable leading man, began to fade from the spotlight. Not with scandal, not with disgrace, but with silence. And so he disappeared, not just from screens, but from public life. His fans wondered. Rumors spread. Some assumed he had retired. Others thought he had lost his passion. But the truth was far more human. He was in pain. Physically, emotionally, financially. But those pieces, that part of the story, we'll get to soon. For now, picture him in those golden years. Towering on screen. Warm in his interviews. Quietly carrying the weight of an industry that would one day forget his name. Until it remembered him again. Because there's something you should know. Brendan Fraser never stopped being who he was. Hollywood just stopped looking. But that is only the beginning. There's a particular kind of sadness that only exists in quiet people. The ones who make us laugh. The ones who seem invincible. The ones who never, ever complain. Brendan Fraser was one of them. At the height of his career, he was everywhere, swinging through the jungle, escaping mummies, dancing through romantic comedies. He was handsome, but approachable. Funny, but sincere. Strong, but kind. A rare combination that made him beloved by families, studios, and the public alike. But there's something we often forget about these kinds of stars. We forget to ask how they're doing. Because they're always smiling. Always delivering. Always grateful. And Brendan was all of that. Even when he was breaking down, body, mind, and spirit. Let's start with the physical. Fraser didn't use stunt doubles the way most actors do. He insisted on doing much of the work himself, throwing punches, leaping from rooftops, getting slammed into walls, dangling from wires for hours. It looked heroic on screen, but off-screen, it came with a price. Over the course of a decade, Brendan's body was falling apart. He underwent multiple surgeries, a partial knee replacement, a laminectomy to relieve pressure on his spinal cord, vocal cord repairs. He was in and out of hospitals for 7 years. 7 years of being put back together. 7 years of trying to maintain a body the world thought was indestructible. And through it all, he didn't stop working. Because Brendan was raised with a quiet ethic: be dependable, be humble, be grateful. So he kept showing up, even when he was in pain. Even when he couldn't sleep. Even when his body was screaming. And then came the emotional weight. In 2003, Brendan experienced something that would change the trajectory of his life, and he kept it to himself for years. At a luncheon hosted by the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, he was sexually assaulted by a powerful industry figure. Fraser later described it in detail. The man groped him in a crowded room. Brendan froze, confused, humiliated, and deeply shaken. He told a few people. Nothing happened. He didn't go public. He didn't name names. Because that's what you're taught to do in Hollywood: keep quiet. Especially if you're a man. Especially if you're the leading man. But it haunted him. Not just the violation itself, but what it represented. A system that didn't protect him. A world that only wanted the smile, not the story behind it. And then, his personal life began to unravel. His marriage ended. He became estranged from parts of the industry. Roles dried up. Studios stopped calling. To the public, It seemed like he'd simply faded, moved on, slowed down. But inside, he was grieving. He was grieving his body, his youth, his marriage, his place in an industry that had once embraced him, then discarded him when he wasn't shining as brightly. And through it all, he never lashed out, never made a scene. He simply stepped back. And that's the thing about people like Brendan Fraser. They don't explode. They withdraw. They disappear slowly, without fanfare. Until one day you realize, where did he go? The truth is, he went nowhere. He was still here. Still gentle. Still kind. Still broken. But he was waiting. For the pain to dull. For the storms to pass. For someone, anyone, to ask how he was doing. And maybe that's the part we missed back then. That behind the jokes and action scenes, the fan photos and award shows, there was a man carrying more than he ever let on. And the weight of that? It doesn't show up on screen. It shows up in silence. If the first part of Brendan Fraser's career was like a golden sunrise, then what came next was twilight. Not darkness. Not yet. But a long, aching fade from the warmth he once stood in. You see, not all tragedies come suddenly. Some arrive slowly, like a fog slipping under a locked door. You don't even notice you're surrounded until you can't find the way out. That's what happened to Brendan. In the early 2000s, the world still saw him as the affable adventurer, the lovable goof, the gentle giant with a six-pack and a heart of gold. But behind the scenes, his body had begun to betray him. Years of stunt work had left him in near-constant pain. He was broken in places we never saw. There were back surgeries, knees, vocal cords. He was in and out of hospitals for nearly 7 years, enduring procedure after procedure, all while trying to maintain the physical image of a Hollywood leading man. He joked about it once, in that quiet way he has, saying he felt like someone who'd been put together with tape and ice. But beneath the physical pain, there was something deeper. A sorrow harder to treat. A grief without anesthesia. In 2007, Brendan Fraser's mother, to whom he was extremely close, passed away. He has spoken of her with reverence, with tenderness, like a man who still carries her voice in his mind. That same year, his marriage ended. He and his wife, actress Afton Smith, divorced after 9 years together. They had 3 sons, and Fraser remained a loving father, but the separation, the financial strain, and the emotional toll began to weigh heavily. The divorce settlement required him to pay nearly $900,000 a year in alimony and child support. And in 2013, he filed a request to reduce the payments, stating that he could no longer afford them. People raised eyebrows. How could someone who made millions be broke? They asked. But they weren't asking the right question. Because fame isn't wealth. And wealth, in Hollywood, is often a mirage. He had spent years supporting his family, covering medical bills, enduring physical rehabilitation, and slowly watching as roles dried up. His income had dropped drastically. And yet, his obligations remained enormous. But perhaps the deepest wound came not from loss, but from what he dared to speak aloud. In 2018, Brendan Fraser gave an interview to GQ, soft-spoken, hesitant, like someone finally opening a door long locked. In it, he revealed that he had been sexually assaulted in 2003 at a luncheon hosted by the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. He alleged that a former HFPA president had groped him, a moment that left him feeling violated, humiliated, and worse, erased. Fraser said the incident sent him into a depression. That he began to retreat from the spotlight. That, whether intentionally or not, He felt blacklisted by an industry that had once embraced him. The HFPA conducted an internal investigation and claimed the incident was a joke. Fraser didn't laugh. And he didn't work much after that. He withdrew from red carpets, from press tours, from interviews. He focused on his children, on healing, on surviving. The world mostly forgot him. There were no arrests, no DUIs, no scandals in the tabloids. Just a man quietly disappearing. Not because he burned too bright, but because he carried too much. It's strange, isn't it? We often expect a great fall to be loud, dramatic, explosive. But Brendan Fraser's fall was silent. It was the quiet slipping away of someone who gave too much, endured too long, and suffered without spectacle. And for years, we didn't know. We didn't ask. We didn't see. But sometimes, the softest stories are the ones that linger longest in the dark. And Brendan's silence, his absence, would become the echo that one day brought him back. If there's one thing we often forget about fame, it's how quiet it gets when it leaves you. For Brendan Fraser, it didn't go all at once. There were still small roles, a few indie films, some voice work. But the offers that once came daily, the blockbusters he once anchored, they vanished. The industry that had once celebrated him with red carpets and flashing cameras now barely remembered his name. And those who did remembered the wrong things. The internet began to notice that he looked different. Softer. Older. More withdrawn. Memes spread, some playful, others cruel. Photos of him at fan events, with tired eyes and uncertain smiles, became fuel for online mockery. They called him washed up. They said he had let himself go. But what they didn't see, what they chose not to see, was the man beneath the surface. A man who was healing, who had endured more than anyone knew, who never lashed out, never made excuses, just kept going. Financially, things were tight. Painfully so. His divorce settlement had left him with steep alimony and child support obligations. Despite having once earned tens of millions, he now struggled to keep up with payments, a reality far more common in Hollywood than most would believe. In 2013, when Fraser filed to lower his alimony payments, many assumed it was a stunt, a trick to protect hidden assets. But the truth, as the court documents revealed, was that he had suffered from serious financial decline. His health problems, legal obligations, and vanishing roles had drained him. He was still acting, but the films were often small, obscure, or straight to video. The checks were modest. The public, largely unaware. But here's what makes Fraser's story so different from the others. He never gave up. Even as the industry grew cold, he remained humble, grateful, quietly doing the work, whether the spotlight was on him or not. He appeared in television series, did voice roles in animation, took background parts that barely registered. He didn't chase attention. He didn't sell a tell-all. He didn't spiral. He simply endured. And then, almost like something out of one of his old adventure films, a door opened. In 2021, Fraser was cast in The Whale, a Darren Aronofsky film about a reclusive man grappling with grief, guilt, and identity. The role was demanding, emotional, raw. And Fraser poured everything into it. When the film premiered at the Venice Film Festival in 2022, something extraordinary happened. After the credits rolled, the audience stood and clapped and clapped. For 6 minutes, they applauded Brendan Fraser, tears in his eyes, unable to contain the flood of emotion that years of silence had buried inside him. The video of that moment went viral. Not because it was flashy, but because it was real. A man who had been broken, physically, emotionally, financially, was standing again. And the world finally noticed. Suddenly, people remembered. They remembered the mummy, George of the jungle, school ties, bedazzled crash. They remembered the gentleness, the warmth, the sincerity. And they said, "We're sorry we forgot." In 2023, Brendan Fraser won the Academy Award for Best Actor for The Whale. And when he stood at that podium, older, heavier, weathered by time, he wasn't the same man who once swung from vines or ran from mummies. He was something far rarer. He was proof. Proof that kindness can survive cruelty. That silence is not the same as failure. And that some souls, no matter how deeply buried, can rise again. Brendan Fraser didn't burn out. He didn't explode. He faded, quietly, and then returned with a whisper that shook the room. And in doing so, he reminded us all. The gentle ones are often the strongest of all. The thing about the internet is that it never forgets what you look like. It doesn't remember your pain, not your surgeries, not your quiet heartbreaks, not your long nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what happened to the life you used to know. No, it remembers snapshots, still frames, the before, and the after. For Brendan Fraser, the internet became a mirror, but not the kind you choose to look into. Photos of him at conventions, posing with fans, often in fluorescent lighting, began to circulate. In some of them, he looked tired, softer, older. And the internet, so often eager to tear down what it once worshipped, did what it does best. It mocked. It jeered. It pointed fingers and laughed behind anonymity. They called him Sad Brendan. They made compilations of him, looking depressed. They zoomed in on his face, dissected his body, turned his presence into a punchline. But here's the strange thing about ridicule. Sometimes, if you leave it long enough, it transforms. People started asking questions. Who was this man they were mocking? Why did he look that way? Where had he gone? And why did it feel so unfair? Because unlike other celebrities who fell from grace in a blaze of scandal or ego, Brendan hadn't done anything wrong. He had disappeared. Quietly. He had struggled. Silently. He had endured. Alone. And that began to resonate. In the quiet corners of the internet, in Reddit forums, YouTube essays, Tumblr posts, and whispered Twitter threads, people began to share stories. Someone recalled meeting him at a comic convention and said he was the kindest celebrity they'd ever met. Another posted about how he took time with every fan, even when the line was long and the cameras were off. A video clip surfaced of Brendan being told, during an interview, that the internet loved him, and the moment he choked up with gratitude. And slowly, the mockery gave way to memory. We remembered George of the jungle. We remembered the mummy, and bedazzled, and school ties. We remembered what it felt like to trust someone on screen. To see a man who could be strong without cruelty, funny without sarcasm, good without pretense. The internet, of all places, became the first to say, "We were wrong!" And perhaps that's the quiet power of Brendan Fraser's story. That even in a world addicted to spectacle, it was still possible for sincerity to cut through the noise. That behind every meme, every viral image, there might be a soul we've misunderstood. A story we haven't finished reading. And that sometimes we're lucky enough to get a second chance to listen. There's a word people love to use in Hollywood. Comeback. But what happened to Brendan Fraser wasn't a comeback. It wasn't a PR campaign. It wasn't a rebranding. It wasn't some studio executive's clever idea to resurrect a forgotten star. It was something older. Something deeper. something closer to resurrection. Because Brendan didn't just return to the screen. He returned to us, with all his scars showing. The Whale was not a triumphant blockbuster. It wasn't filled with CGI or sequels or heroic explosions. It was quiet, still, painful. He played a man drowning in his own body. Not as a gimmick, not for shock, but with love, with grief, with the gentle kind of empathy that only someone who has suffered can truly understand. And when that film premiered at the Venice Film Festival in 2022, the theater fell silent when it ended. And then it rose. People stood. Not out of habit. Not out of politeness. But because something real had just happened. Brendan stood there, overwhelmed, tears in his eyes, and the applause didn't stop. Not for 1 minute. Not for 2. But for 6 whole minutes. 6 minutes of the world saying, "We see you. We remember you. We're sorry we forgot." That moment, more than any trophy, was the turning point. Because it wasn't just Hollywood welcoming him back. It was all of us. All of us who had aged. Who had been forgotten. Who had felt discarded when we were no longer shiny, or young, or useful. Brendan Fraser became our mirror. And for once, the reflection wasn't cruel. In 2023, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. But what mattered most wasn't the Oscar. It was how he accepted it, shaking, humble, full of quiet gratitude. He didn't gloat. He didn't boast. He just stood there. Older. Heavier. Softer. Exactly who he was. Exactly who he had always been. You see, Brendan Fraser never changed. He didn't become someone new to earn his place back. He simply endured long enough for the world to catch up to who he really was. That's not a comeback. That's a resurrection. And in the end, maybe that's the most beautiful kind of return there is. Some comebacks feel like quiet triumphs. Others never quite get the chance. We just left Brendan Fraser, a gentle soul weathered by time, injury, and silence, who slowly, patiently found his way back into the light. But not every story has that arc. Some begin with blinding brilliance, and burn far too quickly. Some never fade into the background, they unravel in full view. Our next story is not quiet at all. It's loud, flashing, chaotic. A kind of storm the world couldn't look away from, even as it spun out of control. This is the rise, and slow, painful fall, of Lindsay Lohan. She was America's sweetheart before she was old enough to understand what that meant. With her fiery red hair, mischievous smile, and uncanny charm, Lindsay Lohan wasn't just another child actress, she was the one. There's something rare that happens when a young actor doesn't just play a part, but seems to become it. Lindsay had that. She could slip into characters with the ease of someone far beyond her years, delivering lines with perfect comedic timing or heartbreaking sincerity. She made her film debut in 1998, at the age of 11, in a little Disney movie called The Parent Trap, a remake of the 1961 classic. It could have been forgettable. But Lindsay didn't let it be. Playing twins separated at birth, she managed to create 2 distinct personalities, bouncing effortlessly between accents, moods, and expressions. It was a performance that felt almost supernatural for a child. Critics praised her. Audiences adored her. And Disney saw a star. Throughout her teen years, she became one of the most visible and bankable young actresses in Hollywood. From Freaky Friday to Confessions of a Teenage Drama Queen, her movies weren't just successful, they defined a generation. But it was 2004's Mean Girls that truly solidified her legacy. Written by Tina Fey and directed by Mark Waters, Mean Girls wasn't just a teen comedy. It was a cultural landmark. And at the center of it was Lohan, playing the wide-eyed outsider turned popular Queen Bee. She wasn't just acting. She was commanding the screen. At 18 years old, Lindsay Lohan had the world at her feet. She had multiple box office hits, a music career, magazine covers, fashion deals, and a persona that felt both glamorous and strangely approachable. She wasn't the untouchable pop star, she was the cool girl next door who somehow made it. By 2005, she was being paid millions per film. She signed record deals. She hosted Saturday Night Live. She dated fellow celebrities, drew the attention of tabloids, and partied with the young elite of Hollywood's Golden Circle. Paris Hilton, Britney Spears, Lindsay Lohan. They weren't just celebrities. They were pop culture itself. But beneath the surface of that glittering life, there were cracks forming. Because Lohan wasn't just growing up, she was growing up in public. Every boyfriend, every outfit, every night out was captured, criticized, and consumed. And unlike the carefully protected stars of the past, Lindsay didn't have a shield. She was a teenager navigating fame alone. And fame, as we've seen, is a cruel tutor. She began to miss rehearsals, show up late to set. Stories began to circulate: exhaustion, dehydration, hospital visits. But what they didn't say out loud, not yet, was the truth. Lindsay Lohan was in trouble. And no one, not her team, not the studios, not even the press, seemed willing to stop the machine. Because at that time, her name still sold tickets. Her face still sold magazines. Her scandals were entertaining, and the world kept watching. We watched her unravel. We laughed at it. We memed it. We devoured it. But make no mistake, at the center of that storm was still a girl, barely 20. Still trying to figure out who she was, while the world told her what she had to be. The golden girl of the 2000s didn't fall because she failed. She fell because we built her pedestal too high, too fast, and watched it crack under the weight of expectation. And when it finally broke, we called it entertainment. There's a certain kind of trap that doesn't look like a trap at all. It glitters. It smiles. It smells like perfume and applause. But once you're in it, there's no easy way out. Lindsay Lohan didn't stumble into fame. She was born into it, almost like a fated story. The spotlight found her early, and it loved her. And for a time, she loved it right back. But the thing about fame is, it's not a gift. It's a transaction. And what it took from Lindsay, quietly, and over years, was everything she hadn't yet had time to build. She was still a child when the cameras first turned toward her. Still learning who she was, what she believed, how to be in her own skin. And before she could answer any of those questions, she was handed an identity. She became America's sweetheart, though no one asked if she wanted to be. After the enormous success of Mean Girls, Lindsay was everywhere. Talk shows, red carpets, magazine covers. She was praised for her charm, her comedic timing, her beauty. She was still a teenager, but she was treated like a woman, packaged like a product, and expected to behave like a star. And stars don't stumble. Stars don't cry. Stars don't say no. I often think of that time in her life, that strange in-between where she was no longer a child, but never allowed to be fully human. Because the version of Lindsay the world adored wasn't really her. It was a carefully curated illusion, glamorous, desirable, slightly rebellious but still safe. A character written by agents, stylists, PR teams, and producers. And she played it well. But the problem with playing a character is that you eventually forget who you are underneath. She was barely 18, and already the industry was expecting her to evolve on command. Be sexy, but not vulgar. Be confident, but not difficult. Be adult, but still innocent. Be every fantasy, but never make a mistake. And when you live in that contradiction long enough, it starts to rot you from the inside. Even before the scandals, even before the arrests, Lindsay was already showing signs of straying. She was hounded by paparazzi who followed her into bathrooms. She was gossiped about on every late-night show. Every boyfriend became a headline. Every outfit a controversy. Her body, her weight, her behavior, all dissected daily by people she'd never met. And she smiled through it. Because that's what she was trained to do. She had no time to be lost, no space to be unsure, no room to rest. The machine needed her smiling. The machine needed her pretty. The machine needed her working. There's something particularly cruel about the way fame treats young women. It fetishizes their youth, profits off their sexuality, and punishes them for growing up. Lindsay wasn't the first to go through it. But she may have been the first of her generation to experience it at full digital speed. TMZ, Perez Hilton, tabloid blogs, viral gossip. She became the original it girl of the internet era. And that meant her mistakes weren't just noticed. They were shared, mocked, consumed. Overnight, her life became public property. And the irony? She was still showing up to work. Even as her world spun faster, even as the headlines turned crueler, she was still acting. Still trying. Still hoping to be taken seriously. But the industry had already started pulling away. Quietly, subtly. Producers hesitated. Studios asked questions. Insurance companies refused to cover her. She hadn't even done anything wrong yet. But she was becoming a risk. Because in Hollywood, a woman's image is her currency. And if that image starts to blur, people stop investing. The tragedy is not that Lindsay Lohan fell. It's that she was never allowed to pause. She had no safe space to reflect. No mentors to protect her. No break from the scrutiny. And so, when the real spiral came, the arrests, the addictions, the public meltdowns, it wasn't a shock. It was the natural consequence of a life spent dancing on a tightrope, while the crowd below watched with popcorn. This was the moment where the exit should have been offered. Where someone, anyone, should have said, "Take time. Step back. You don't owe us anything." But no one did. Because the machine doesn't have a pause button. It just keeps filming. And Lindsay? She kept performing, even as her world crumbled. When we talk about people who spiraled, it's often a tidy way of saying they lost control. But that word, spiraling, is deceptively elegant. It sounds almost like a dance. But in reality, it's closer to falling, without ever hitting the ground. For Lindsay Lohan, the fall didn't happen in secret. It happened exactly where she had lived her entire youth, right in front of us. After Mean Girls, her stars should have exploded, more prestige roles, serious recognition, perhaps even awards. Instead, she found herself entangled in the very thing her fame had promised to protect her from: chaos. Her lifestyle, once framed as youthful rebellion, became front-page crisis. Night after night, she was photographed stumbling out of nightclubs, surrounded by paparazzi flashes and whispers of addiction. She was seen with older men, reckless friends, in late-night fights and public outbursts. Her face, once synonymous with Hollywood's future, now symbolized its most notorious successes. And still, She was working. Or trying to. In 2006, she was cast in Georgia Rule alongside Jane Fonda, a role meant to transition her into more adult, dramatic material. But filming quickly descended into controversy. The film's producer, James G. Robinson, made headlines after sending Lindsay a scathing public letter, accusing her of being irresponsible and unprofessional, citing chronic lateness and absence due to what was described as exhaustion. It wasn't just a warning, it was a signal. Hollywood, once indulgent of her youth, had begun to lose patience. But the real spiral began in earnest in 2007. In January, Lindsay entered rehab for the first time, at just 20 years old. The public reaction was immediate, sympathy mixed with sarcasm, concern wrapped in spectacle. Because for many, this wasn't tragic. It was entertaining. That same year, she was arrested twice for driving under the influence, once in May, and again in July. The second time, police discovered cocaine in her possession. She wore an alcohol detection ankle bracelet to parties. Paparazzi zoomed in on it like it was jewelry. She went in and out of rehab facilities 3 times in just over a year. Each time, headlines blared the details. Not as calls for compassion, but as clicks, gossip, punchlines. Then came court dates, mugshots, photos of her in orange jumpsuits, tearful courtroom appearances, sentences, probation violations. In 2010, she was sentenced to 90 days in jail for violating probation. She served 14. Later that year, she failed another drug test, another stint in rehab, another hearing. It became a loop: court, rehab, relapse, repeat, and the world watched as if it were a television show. A real-life soap opera, packaged as tabloid gold. But let's pause for a moment. Because behind the headlines was still a person. A girl who had been working since she was 3 years old. A teenager raised on sets and red carpets, rewarded for charm and punished for boundaries. A young woman navigating addiction, a disease, in full public view, with no room to fall quietly. We laughed at her breakdowns. We shared her mugshots like trading cards. And somewhere in the blur of flashbulbs and judgment, Hollywood quietly walked away. Studios no longer trusted her. Insurance companies refused to cover her. Directors were hesitant. Producers avoided her name. She tried to stage comebacks. A biopic here, a guest role there, but the machine had moved on. She was no longer a product worth investing in. And so, she began disappearing. Not in the tragic sense, like others, but in a slower, more haunting way. One day she was everywhere. The next, she was a rumor. There were moments when she tried to reclaim the narrative. Interviews where she promised she'd changed. A reality show? A few endorsements. But the public no longer believed her, and worse, no longer cared. She was branded. Not as an artist, not as an actress, not even as a person, but as a cautionary tale. And here's the cruelest part. While we allowed male stars to redeem themselves, to rise again after mistakes and meltdowns, we didn't offer the same to her. She wasn't given the benefit of age or healing. Because in the court of public opinion, young women aren't allowed to fall apart. They're expected to shine, to stay beautiful, to stay marketable. And when they don't, we discard them. That's what happened to Lindsay Lohan. She spiraled, yes, but she spiraled in our spotlight. We put her there, and then we turned it off. By the time the flashing cameras dimmed and the headlines turned toward newer scandals, Lindsay Lohan was left standing in the aftermath, not as a villain, not even as a victim, but as a young woman who had simply run out of runway. Her fame hadn't disappeared, it had hollowed out. She was still a name, still recognizable. But fame, as we know, does not mean stability. And in Lindsay's case, it certainly didn't mean wealth. Because while the world watched her spiral, very few noticed what was happening behind the curtain. Her finances were falling apart. At her peak, Lindsay was reportedly earning millions per film. For Herbie, fully loaded, just my luck Georgia Rule, she commanded salaries between $7 and $10 million. Add to that endorsement deals, magazine covers, and 2 moderately successful pop albums. And on paper, she should have been set for life. But that's the thing about paper. It doesn't account for chaos. When the roles stopped coming and her public image deteriorated, the income dried up, but the spending didn't. She had become accustomed to a lifestyle that was no longer sustainable: personal assistants, private jets, stylists, international travel, high-end apartments in Los Angeles, New York, and London. And beyond the extravagance came the legal costs. Each arrest brought court fees, legal teams, bail. Each stint in rehab cost tens of thousands. Missed film shoots led to lawsuits, insurance claims, and settlements. In 2010, she was sued by a boutique for nearly $17,000 in unpaid charges. That same year, she reportedly owed $600,000 in credit card debt. Then came the government. In 2009, the IRS filed a federal tax lien against her for unpaid taxes, totaling over $93,000 for the 2007 fiscal year. That number would later balloon into hundreds of thousands more. And like so many who come into fortune young, Lindsay admitted she never really learned how to manage money. In an interview, she once described herself as a target, surrounded by people who took advantage of her generosity and her confusion. Entourages, managers, supposed friends, many of whom were more interested in her wallet than her well-being. So when Oprah Winfrey offered her a docuseries deal in 2014, it wasn't just a chance at redemption, it was a lifeline. The show, Lindsay, aired on the Oprah Winfrey Network and followed her attempts to get sober, rebuild her life, and return to acting. But even then, the cracks were showing. The series captured her missing scheduled shoots, struggling to find direction, caught between hope and habit. It didn't spark the comeback she had hoped for. And so, like many whose names no longer held power in Hollywood, she left. By 2015, Lindsay Lohan had effectively disappeared from the American entertainment world. She moved to London, then Dubai, places where paparazzi laws were stricter and privacy was easier to come by. For a time, she lived abroad almost entirely, out of the spotlight, out of the conversation, out of the storm. She made sporadic attempts to reignite her career. A guest appearance in Sick Note alongside Rupert Grint. A short-lived MTV reality show set in a beach club she opened in Mykonos. Endorsement deals with fashion brands and online marketplaces. She even returned to acting in 2022, starring in a Netflix holiday movie called Falling for Christmas. A small, safe bet. Nostalgic. Gentle. Familiar. And for some fans, a welcome reminder of who she once was. But the truth is, the machine had already moved on. Her net worth, once estimated in the tens of millions, dropped drastically. By some estimates, she had fallen below $1 million by the late 2010s. Though that number has likely recovered slightly in recent years, it remains a far cry from the heights she once soared. And yet, there's a strange piece to her exile. In interviews, Lindsay has spoken of being happier outside the U.S., of feeling safe, free from the judgment, the flashbulbs, the constant pressure. She married quietly, began a family, lived. And maybe that's the final twist. That after all the noise, the scandals, the falls, she found what she had never been allowed to have. A normal life. Not a perfect one. Not a comeback fairy tale. But a quieter existence, far from the spotlight that once lit her up and burned her down. In the end, Lindsay Lohan didn't disappear. She just stepped out of the frame. And maybe, after everything, that's the happiest ending she could write for herself. Fame, you see, doesn't always abandon you. Sometimes, it just changes shape. It stops singing your name in flashing lights and starts whispering it in bathrooms, in courtrooms, in checkout aisles, in every room you enter, whether you want it there or not. Lindsay Lohan never stopped being famous. She just stopped being in control of how she was famous. For a time, she became what I can only describe as a walking headline, not a person, but a template. A punchline in late-night monologues. A pap photo waiting to happen. A lesson parents whispered about to their teenage daughters. And that is a special kind of cruelty. Because when you're a child star, the world feels like your stage. But when you fall, the world feels like your cell phone camera. Every drink, every misstep, every slip. Immortalized, judged, packaged, resold. She was mocked for stumbling out of nightclubs, even when she was doing nothing more than walking to her car. She was accused of being out of control, even when she was just trying to live the kind of life people her age lived every night without consequences. That's the thing about Lindsay. She didn't fall from grace because she was evil, or monstrous, or dishonest. She fell because she grew up. And the world wasn't ready to let her. We don't like watching girls become women in public. Not really. We want them shiny, polished, smiling. But as soon as they start to express anger, sexuality, fear, or fatigue, we call them difficult, out of control, or worse, ungrateful. Lindsay tried. She tried to disappear, and they followed her. She tried to reinvent herself, and they laughed. She tried to tell her side, and they rolled their eyes. There were moments, brief ones, when it seemed she might take it all back. The 2012 Elizabeth Taylor biopic, her interviews with Oprah, the Beach Club reality series in Mykonos, a brief appearance on Saturday Night Live, where she even poked fun at herself. But the machine that builds you rarely wants to fix you, only to watch you rust in public. So Lindsay did something very few people saw coming. She left. She moved to Dubai. No paparazzi. No tabloid culture. No TMZ. She started a quieter life, working behind the scenes, managing clubs, reading scripts, staying out of the chaos. For a long time, it seemed like she had vanished completely. But even from a distance, the mirror stayed close. Because that's what it means to be a girl like her, raised inside the glass cage of Hollywood. You're always being reflected, always being misremembered, always being measured against a version of yourself that was never yours to begin with. She once said, "People have this misconception of me. I'm just a girl. I'm just figuring myself out. I'm just trying to live my life." And those words, simple as they are, carry more weight than most people realize. Because Lindsay Lohan wasn't just a girl. She was every girl who grew up too fast, in too much light, with too many people watching. She was the avatar of millennial fame, manufactured, devoured, discarded. And then, quietly, stubbornly, reborn. Not with fanfare. Not with a blockbuster. But with stillness. In 2022, she returned again. Not with glitter. Not with tabloid ink. But with a Netflix holiday film, small, sweet, warm. And for the first time in years, People weren't watching to see her fall. They were watching because they missed her. That's what survival looks like for women like Lindsay. Not revenge. Not even redemption. But peace. Peace on your own terms. Peace that no headline can rewrite. She may never again be the golden girl of the early 2000s. But maybe that's the point. Because gold, as any historian knows, is soft. Easily shaped. Easily stolen. But iron? Iron is what's forged in fire. And Lindsay Lohan, for all the noise, for all the shame, for all the years the world tried to break her, is still standing. Maybe not as a star, but as a survivor. And sometimes, that's the greater title. If Lindsay Lohan's downfall felt like a slow, chaotic unraveling, youth tangled in fame and fragility, then the man we're about to speak of lived something very different. His rise wasn't soft or subtle. It was violent, swift, biblical. He didn't fall quietly. He crashed. This is the story of a fighter. Not just in the ring, but in life. A man whose name became a synonym for both greatness and catastrophe. You didn't have to like boxing to know him. You didn't even have to know sports. Because for a time, Mike Tyson wasn't just the most feared boxer on earth. He was one of the most famous human beings alive. And it all started with a broken boy. The king of the ring. Michael Gerard Tyson was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1966, into a world already stacked against him. His father abandoned the family early on. His mother, Lorna, struggled with poverty, health issues, and grief. Tyson grew up in some of the roughest neighborhoods in New York. Exposed to crime, violence, and trauma before he even knew how to spell the words. By the age of 13, he had been arrested nearly 40 times. Not because he was inherently cruel, but because the world he inhabited taught survival through force. He was small at first, timid even, but when his size caught up with his fury, he became something else entirely. And then, like fate opening one brief window, someone saw him. A boxing trainer named Bobby Stewart, who recognized the raw, volcanic potential in the troubled teen. Stewart introduced Tyson to a man who would become more than a coach, Cus D'Amato. D'Amato was a legend. He had trained champions. He believed in discipline, control, and emotional strength as much as he did in punching power. He didn't just take Tyson in, he adopted him, both formally and spiritually. Under D'Amato's guidance, Tyson transformed. He channeled his rage into precision, his chaos into structure. His fists became guided missiles. His footwork? Uncanny. His head movement? Terrifying. He turned his body into a weapon, his mind into a machine. And then, he started knocking people out. Not in the 7th round. Not in the 3rd. In the 1st. Sometimes in the 1st minute. Tyson's early fights weren't contests. They were executions. Men trained for months to face him, and they lasted seconds. He didn't dance around the ring. He marched, relentless and emotionless, like something mechanical. By 1986, at the age of just 20, he became the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. He was now the king, and the crown was heavy with gold. Tyson's fights became global events. He was boxing's biggest draw, the ultimate spectacle. Promoters made millions. Broadcasters built their schedules around him. Celebrities lined the front row to watch the carnage. Tyson was earning $30 million per fight at his peak. He signed endorsement deals, bought mansions, cars, tigers, yes, literal tigers. He married actress Robin Givens in a famously turbulent union. His face appeared in video games, magazines, commercials. There were stories of $100,000 shopping sprees in a single afternoon, gold bathtubs, custom-built motorcycles, an estate so big it had its own nightclub inside. At his height, Mike Tyson's net worth was estimated at over $300 million. But wealth doesn't fix pain, and fame doesn't teach healing. Inside, the same rage that had made him a champion had never truly quieted. He was still the boy from Brooklyn, still angry, still raw. And now, surrounded by yes-men, hangers-on, and opportunists. He once said, "People in boxing told me I was the greatest. But they weren't there to help me. They were there to use me." That's the dark irony of meteoric success. It isolates you. You're adored by crowds but alone in the dressing room. And the bigger you get, the less anyone tells you the truth. So the champion kept rising, until he started imploding. In 1990, in a moment that shocked the sports world, Tyson lost to Buster Douglas, a 42-1 underdog. A man who had just lost his mother. A man who refused to be knocked out. It was Tyson's first professional loss, and it rattled the image of invincibility. But it wasn't just the loss. It was what it symbolized. The edge was dulling. The focus was slipping. The demons were waking. By the early 90s, Mike Tyson was still feared, but also erratic. Unpredictable. And just as his fists had launched him into the heavens, his life and legacy were about to spiral into the abyss. I've always believed that some men aren't made for peace. Not because they choose violence, but because violence is the only language they were ever taught. Mike Tyson learned that language very young, and for a while, he used it to build an empire. But what the world saw as power was often just pain, wearing gloves. By the late 1980s, Mike Tyson was on top of the world. The youngest heavyweight champion in history. Undefeated. Untouchable. Unbelievable. He was the kind of athlete that didn't come around once in a generation. He came once in a century. The perfect storm of speed, strength, and sheer terror. When Tyson walked into the ring, grown men, trained fighters, would flinch. And outside the ring, he was rich, famous, desired, a pop culture icon. Video games, endorsements, late-night talk shows. He was photographed in tuxedos and gold chains, hugged by celebrities, envied by rappers and Wall Street bankers alike. But inside, he was still that kid from Brownsville. Still abandoned. Still angry. Still carrying years of unspoken trauma like a weight strapped to his chest. You see, Mike didn't just fight to win. He fought to destroy. And that hunger came from somewhere deep. Somewhere darker than most people could ever imagine. His adoptive trainer, Cus D'Amato, had once said, "The hero and the coward both feel the same fear. But the hero uses it." Mike became the hero. But that fear, and the rage behind it, never really left him. And as his fame grew, so did the madness of his world. Tyson's inner circle ballooned with opportunists. Yes men. Party girls. Crooks in suits. Spiritual advisors and con men. They all told him what he wanted to hear, that he was untouchable. That he was above consequence. That he was still the scared boy, but now with armor. And Tyson, who had never been taught to trust anyone, trusted them. His behavior grew erratic. He spent money like it wasn't real. He bought tigers for pets, because he could. He crashed Lamborghinis, married and divorced in the public eye, got into fistfights at nightclubs, and trashed hotel rooms in minutes. He once got into a street fight with Mitch Green, a former opponent, at a Harlem clothing store. Tyson shattered Green's face. Tyson's hand? Split open. And yet, he was still the king. still fighting, still winning, still terrifying. But the press had begun to shift. The stories weren't just about knockouts anymore. They were about lawsuits, drug rumors, violent outbursts, women, threats. Tyson was still marketable, but he was becoming unpredictable. And when that happens in the business of image, the machine starts to hesitate. Even in the ring, there were signs. He began skipping training, partying more, gaining weight, losing focus. And the opponents, once trembling, started to sense something. The monster wasn't sleeping, but maybe he was drifting. The Tyson that Cus D'Amato had sculpted, the disciplined warrior, was being replaced by someone else. Someone reckless, angry, hollowed out by everything fame had promised and failed to deliver. And no one around him had the courage to stop the train. Because why would they? They were all on board, profiting, feeding, enabling. And Mike? He didn't see it. Because when you've been broken as a child, when you've grown up in chaos, you don't always recognize when something is wrong. You just think it's normal. That's the tragedy of it. Tyson wasn't losing control. He never really had it. The storm had always been there. It just hadn't hit the shore yet. But it would. And when it did, it would take everything with it. You can be the strongest man in the world, but it won't save you from yourself. By the time the 1990s unfolded, Mike Tyson was no longer just a boxer. He was a symbol, a living myth, a man who had rewritten the rules of fame, violence, and masculinity. But what most people didn't know, or didn't want to see, was that Tyson was also drowning. Not in defeat, not in poverty, but in temptation, rage, and untreated trauma. Let's be clear about something. Mike Tyson wasn't just a victim of fame, he was also its executioner. He made choices, terrible ones, and the consequences would define the second act of his life. After his shocking 1990 loss to Buster Douglas, Tyson's career hit a strange, chaotic phase. He still won fights, his fists were still deadly, but he seemed untethered. Suspended between two identities, the gladiator and the child who never healed. And outside the ring, he was self-destructing. There were stories, many of them. He once crashed a $500,000 Bentley into a tree while high. He threw wild parties with exotic animals. He headbutted reporters. He was fined, arrested, sued. He was suspended from boxing after testing positive for marijuana. He went to rehab, then relapsed, then went again. But the most shattering moment came in 1992, when Mike Tyson was convicted of rape. The trial gripped the nation. Tyson was accused of sexually assaulting Desiree Washington, an 18-year-old Miss Black America contestant, in an Indianapolis hotel room. Tyson claimed the encounter was consensual. The jury disagreed. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, of which he served just under 3. In court, he was defiant. In prison, he was isolated. And when he emerged, he was not the same man. Prison did not humble Tyson. It hardened him. He had always seen the world as a battleground, now, even more so. And yet, somehow, the public was still hungry for him. When he returned to boxing in 1995, millions tuned in. He won fights, easily at first, but his image had shifted. He was no longer the clean-cut kid from the early posters. He was a menace. Tattooed. Angry. Speaking in riddles. Exploding at press conferences. In 1997, during a championship bout against Evander Holyfield, Tyson committed one of the most infamous acts in sports history. After being headbutt earlier in the match, Tyson bit off a piece of Holyfield's ear. Let that sink in. In front of millions, in a moment of total emotional collapse, Tyson bit a man's ear in the ring. He was disqualified, fined $3 million, and suspended indefinitely. That moment, grotesque, surreal, unforgettable, became the defining image of Tyson's decline. Not a knockout. Not a speech. A bite. A man losing control. A man who didn't know where the ring ended and the war inside him began. From there, things spiraled even further. He married and divorced. He fought and sued. He was arrested for assault, possession, driving under the influence. He was banned in several states from fighting. And through it all, the money kept flowing out. Because that's the thing about fame, it doesn't ask if you're ready. It doesn't care if you can manage a checkbook or file your taxes. And Tyson couldn't. He once said he didn't even know what a budget was. He owned multiple mansions, exotic pets, fleets of luxury cars, a private nightclub, and a gold bathtub worth $2 million. He once spent $400,000 on pigeons and big cats, and gifted strangers Rolexes like they were party favors. He gave away cars, paid for entourages, hired spiritual gurus and animal trainers, bought silk bedding for his tiger. He lived like a pharaoh, but with the emotional awareness of a wounded child. And the demons that haunted him, the violence, the addiction, the self-hatred, they never left. He later admitted to fighting while high, to not knowing who he was when he looked in the mirror, to feeling like a ghost who had briefly been mistaken for a god. Mike Tyson had gone from the most feared man in sports to a cautionary tale. From Madison Square Garden to mug shots. From Wheaties boxes to prison cells. His fists could conquer men. But they couldn't conquer what was eating him alive from the inside. By the early 2000s, Mike Tyson was no longer a king. He wasn't feared. He wasn't envied. He was tired, broke, and adrift. On paper, he had earned more than $400 million over the course of his boxing career. But paper lies. What mattered now was reality. The cars were gone. The mansions were gone. The entourage was gone. In 2003, Mike Tyson filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The documents listed over $23 million in debt, including unpaid taxes, legal judgments, child support, and loans from people who were once friends. It was the final blow. But unlike the others, this one didn't come from a punch. It came from years of emotional hemorrhaging, and the silence of no longer being needed. He had nothing left. No belt. No money. No trust. Just a name. And a body no longer built for war. So what does a man like that do? He starts over. Not in the ring. Not at a press conference. But alone. Quietly. Slowly. In the years that followed, Tyson began the long, strange path to reinvention. At first, it was awkward, even uncomfortable. He appeared in The Hangover in 2009, playing himself, poking fun at his own downfall. It was a small role, but it hit hard. People laughed. They were surprised to see him vulnerable, soft-spoken, oddly charming. Something clicked. The world wasn't angry at him anymore. It was curious. He leaned into it. He started appearing on talk shows, podcasts, and TV spots, not as Iron Mike, but as a reflective, open version of himself. He told stories. He apologized. He cried. And we listened. He admitted to past mistakes, the violence, the addiction, the selfishness. He didn't hide behind excuses. He didn't try to rewrite the past. Instead, he told the truth. In 2013, he published a memoir, undisputed truth, raw, graphic, devastating. It detailed the highs, the crashes, the shame. It didn't ask for pity. It asked for honesty. Then came Mike Tyson. Undisputed Truth, the Broadway show directed by Spike Lee, where Tyson stood alone on stage, night after night, telling his story with brutal, uncomfortable sincerity. And people came. Not to see a fighter, but to see a man. In recent years, Tyson's renaissance has taken strange and fascinating forms. He launched a popular podcast, Hot Boxin' with Mike Tyson, where he interviews everyone from athletes to philosophers, often high, always heartfelt. He invested in the cannabis industry, founding a marijuana company and talking openly about how we'd helped him manage depression and trauma. He continued acting, not always well, not always gracefully, but without shame. He even returned to boxing in 2020, at age 54, for an exhibition match against Roy Jones Jr. It wasn't about dominance. It was about legacy. About love. About peace. He later said, "I used to think being tough was about hurting people. Now I know it's about being honest." That is the transformation. Because Tyson didn't stage a comeback to reclaim the crown. He wasn't trying to be champion again. He was trying to be human. And perhaps that's what makes his journey so powerful. He started as a myth, became a monster, and ended up a man. One who is still flawed, still healing, still learning, but one who, in the end, survived not because he fought hardest, but because he finally stopped fighting himself. But the night, as always, has more stories to tell. Because not every fall from grace begins with fists. Some begin in palaces, not built from marble or gold, but from scripts and camera lights, from velvet red carpets and golden statues. Some rise not with a roar, but with a quiet, hypnotic voice, a crooked smile, and eyes that seem to be chasing something you can't quite see. Our next tale belongs to a man who didn't fight in a ring, but in the wild arena of imagination. He didn't lose everything in a single blow, but in 1,000 purchases, 1,000 strange decisions, each more mystifying than the last. He was Hollywood royalty, an Oscar winner, a household name, and somehow he spent it all. This is the story of Nicolas Cage, and the fortune that couldn't be spent. You've seen him, haven't you? In films that were too loud, too strange, too chaotic to be anything but unforgettable. But before the memes, before the whispers of decline, there was a time when Nicolas Cage was not a curiosity. He was a phenomenon. An Oscar-winning actor. A box office titan. And a man with a fortune so immense, so absurdly large, that even he could not spend it all wisely. Or perhaps he tried. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Cage's wealth was estimated to be in the neighborhood of $150 million. That's not a typo. $150 million. And yet, not long after, he would be neck-deep in debt, drowning in unpaid taxes, and selling his prized possessions just to stay afloat. But how does one lose such a treasure? That tale begins with a hunger. You see, Cage wasn't like other celebrities, where most bought one or two luxury items and called it indulgence. Cage built an empire of eccentricity. His taste in possessions, if we dare call them that, read more like the private museum of an ancient monarch or a comic book villain. Let's start with real estate. At one point, Cage owned 15 homes around the world. Not modest mansions. No. We're talking castles. Yes, literal medieval castles. One in Bavaria, Germany, another in Bath, England. He even tried to buy Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale fortress that inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle. The German government politely declined. He owned a haunted mansion in New Orleans, once home to the infamous Madame LaLaurie, a woman associated with some of the most gruesome legends in American history. Cage later admitted he purchased the house hoping to write a horror novel there. Instead, he lost the house to foreclosure. And then there were the islands. 2 private islands in the Bahamas. Tropical paradises that he barely used, each costing millions to acquire and maintain. But real estate was just the beginning. Cage had a passion, no, an obsession, with rare artifacts, often the kind one might expect to see in a National Treasure film. He paid $276,000 for a dinosaur skull, a 70-million-year-old Tyrannosaurus bataar fossil, only to later return it to the Mongolian government when it turned out to be stolen. He also bought shrunken pygmy heads, a 9-foot-tall burial tomb which he planned to be buried in, and a collection of ancient Egyptian relics. Legend has it he once bid over $300,000 to outbid Leonardo DiCaprio on a rare comic book, Action Comics #1, the first appearance of Superman. Cage was a lifelong comic book fan, and that particular purchase reflected both his inner child and his inability to say no. At one point, Cage owned 50 vehicles, including 9 Rolls-Royces. Not to mention a Lamborghini once owned by the Shah of Iran, and a Ferrari Enzo, one of the rarest Ferraris in existence. And of course, there were yachts, including one 125-foot vessel called Saraband, which came with its own staff and cost millions to maintain each year. But it wasn't just the quantity of spending, it was the speed, the impulsivity, the sense that Cage was chasing something intangible. Some say he was trying to surround himself with meaning, that each object was a symbol, a talisman against the emptiness that fame often brings. Others suggest he simply never believed the river of wealth would run dry. He once told the New York Times, "When I was buying things, I was looking for another piece of the puzzle. I thought I was building some kind of map to where I was going next in my life." That's a remarkable thing to say, isn't it? Not I wanted to show off, or I didn't know better. But I was building a map. But in that map, there were no roads leading to financial responsibility. And the compass, it seems, was broken. Even his pets were extravagant. He owned 2 albino king cobras, named Moby and Sheba, and a 2-headed snake, a creature so rare it belonged more in myth than in Malibu. Cage even kept a shark and an octopus, claiming the latter helped him with his acting. Of course, he lived not like a movie star, but like an emperor who had awoken in modern times, bewildered by restraint and allergic to limits. And for a time, it worked. The movies kept coming. The paychecks were enormous. He was working constantly, sometimes 5 or 6 films a year. But the faster he earned, the faster he spent. And before long, the weight of it all, the castles, the cars, the islands, the artifacts, began to crumble. But that is another chapter. For now, picture him in those days, wandering the corridors of his mansion lined with shrunken heads and samurai swords. Pacing beside his tomb-shaped crypt, a man surrounded by treasures, and still, somehow, looking for something more. Some call it madness. Others call it art. But I call it a tragedy in silk robes. Some people fall because of scandal. Others fall because of addiction. But Nicolas Cage? He fell because he wanted everything. Not out of greed, no. Greed is cold and calculated. What Cage had was something else entirely. He had an obsession. A hunger. A kind of mythological restlessness that drove him to chase beauty, art, meaning, and yes, madness, in all its forms. Even when the cameras weren't rolling, Nicolas Cage was a character. He spoke like an old-world poet. He studied philosophy. He wore velvet jackets to the grocery store. He gave interviews that sounded more like riddles than sound bites. And at the height of his fame, after leaving Las Vegas, face/off, The Rock, national treasure, he was making over $20 million per film. He was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. And for a while, it made perfect sense. Because he was everywhere. But here's the thing. The money. It wasn't staying. Because Cage wasn't just acting like an eccentric. He was living like one. And living like that, full tilt, no breaks, comes at a price. This is the part of the story that most people laughed at back then. The headlines were everywhere. Nicolas Cage buys a castle in Germany. Nicolas Cage buys another castle, this time in England. Nicolas Cage buys a dinosaur skull, a real one, for $276,000. Nicolas Cage outbids Leonardo DiCaprio for a fossilized Mongolian T-Rex skull, which turned out to be stolen and had to be returned to the Mongolian government. Nicolas Cage buys an octopus to help him with his acting. Nicolas Cage buys shrunken pygmy heads, a two-headed snake, dozens of rare comics, and a haunted mansion in New Orleans once owned by a woman who tortured slaves. These weren't investments. They weren't trophies. They were possessions in the truest sense of the word. And the list goes on. 15 personal homes. A fleet of Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, Lamborghinis. A Gulfstream jet. A private island in the Bahamas. A mausoleum in the shape of a pyramid, where he plans to be buried. To Cage, these things weren't wasteful. They were romantic. Symbolic. Mysterious. They were part of a larger personal mythology he was building, one where every object told a story, every purchase was an act of rebellion against boring, ordinary life. But the numbers. They don't care about romance. By the late 2000s, the IRS had come knocking. Cage reportedly owed over $13 million in unpaid taxes. He blamed his business manager. His business manager blamed him. What we know is this. The empire was crumbling. Lawsuits piled up. Properties were seized. He had to sell his beloved homes, his prized collectibles, his sacred curiosities. One by one, the stories were liquidated. And unlike others in Hollywood who might have quietly slipped into retirement, Cage didn't hide. He kept working, relentlessly. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. He accepted roles in dozens of low-budget, often bizarre films. Sometimes 5, 6, even 7 movies a year, just to keep up with what he called a mountain of debt. And critics were cruel. They mocked his choices. They joked about the wigs, the accents, the over-the-top performances. They said he'd lost it. That he'd become a parody of himself. But here's what they didn't see. Through it all, Cage kept trying. He kept acting. Even in the most absurd productions, he gave everything, full volume, full heart, full madness. Because underneath the financial chaos, beneath the strange purchases and crumbling mansions, there was still a man who loved storytelling. A man who wanted to feel something, even if it cost him everything. He once said, "I'm not a man of regrets. I learn from everything I do." And that might just be the most Nicolas Cage thing ever spoken. We left him, didn't we? In a hall of his own making, walls lined with relics, floors echoing with the silence of castles once full of music and laughter, and overhead, a sky he tried to tame with money. But the storm always finds its way. By the mid-2000s, Nicolas Cage's life had become not only unsustainable, but mathematically impossible. The fortune he had once wielded like a king's scepter began to collapse beneath him, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a crumbling estate losing stones from the walls with every passing wind. it wasn't simply reckless spending. It was something more insidious. A man out of step with time, out of tune with caution, and utterly unprepared for what the real world would demand in return for his fantasy. The avalanche began quietly, as most do. In 2007, the IRS came knocking. Cage had accumulated millions in unpaid taxes, stretching back several years. He owed the federal government over $6.3 million in back taxes, primarily from 2007, but it was just the tip of a much larger, snow-covered mountain of debt. And the trouble was, he didn't just owe taxes. He owed banks, private lenders, real estate firms, and even former business associates. Multiple lawsuits were filed against him, some involving unpaid loans and mortgages, others involving missed payments on the various homes he had scattered across the globe. One by one, his properties went into foreclosure. His New Orleans haunted mansion, gone. His Las Vegas estate, gone. A Hollywood Hills home, a Rhode Island mansion, a Bel Air compound, and even a Bavarian castle, all gone, repossessed, or sold at a loss. He was forced to sell many of his most prized possessions. The dinosaur skull? Gone. The Action Comics #1 that he had fought Leonardo DiCaprio to win? Sold at auction in 2011 for over $2 million, one of the few items that actually turned a profit. But the rest? Art, jewelry, luxury cars, rare books, memorabilia, much of it was sold in a panic, far below its original value, just to keep the hounds at bay. But what's most heartbreaking is the betrayal. Cage would later file a lawsuit against his former business manager, Samuel Levin, accusing him of negligence and fraud, claiming that Levin had failed to properly manage his assets, had not warned him of his worsening financial state, and had plunged him into economic ruin. Levin responded with his own legal filings, painting a very different picture, that Cage had ignored repeated warnings, that he had been advised to reduce his expenses, to sell some homes, to simplify, but had refused, living instead like a man immune to consequence. Who was telling the truth? Perhaps both were. The deeper tragedy is that Cage was not just a victim of bad advice, but of his own enchantment. Enchanted with freedom. With the illusion that if you keep moving fast enough, the walls can never close in. To cover his growing debts, he began accepting almost every film offer that came his way. Big or small, good or bad, it didn't matter. Where once he had been selective, now he was ubiquitous. In the span of just a few years, he appeared in a dizzying number of movies, some that barely made it to theaters, others that were quietly forgotten on streaming services or DVD shelves. His performances remained passionate, often brilliant, but many wondered, why is Nicolas Cage in everything? The answer was desperation. Each film was another brick thrown onto the avalanche, another attempt to stop the slide. And yet, the more he worked, the more hollow the returns. Not just financially, but artistically. The industry that had once celebrated him began to mock him. Audiences were confused. Critics were cruel. But still he worked. Tirelessly. Relentlessly. Not with vanity, but won suspects with regret. With a kind of grim determination to set things right, even as the world turned its back. In 2009, Forbes listed Cage as one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. But behind the scenes, he was hemorrhaging money. That same year, he officially filed for bankruptcy. And think of this, a man who once held $150 million, reduced to a figure on a form, a name on a list of debtors, a whisper in the halls of financial ruin. There is something mythic about it, isn't there? Like Icarus, whose wings melted when he flew too close to the sun. But Cage's wings were built not of wax and feathers, but castles and cobras. It is said that when you build your life on illusion, even the truth begins to blur. And for Cage, the line between character and self, between fantasy and reality, was always thin, always dancing in the heat of the spotlight. But even a spotlight casts shadows. And when the curtain falls, and the applause fades, it is in the darkness that the consequences come. And they came for Nicolas. It's a strange thing, watching a man who once stood on Olympus begin to descend, step by reluctant step, into the foothills of forgotten cinema. Once, Nicolas Cage was not merely a star. He was a supernova. A name that drew crowds. A performer whose face adorned posters across the globe. He won an Academy Award for Leaving Las Vegas, a devastating, poetic portrait of a man lost in self-destruction. And from there, he seemed unstoppable. He anchored some of the biggest action films of the 1990s. The Rock, Face/Off, Con Air, each one louder, bolder, more unhinged than the last. He was an action hero with the heart of a character actor. Strange. Intense. Magnetic. And then came National Treasure. A film that shouldn't have worked, but did. A history-soaked adventure that became a phenomenon, making Cage not just critically respected, but bankable. He was paid handsomely. Studios trusted him. Audiences embraced him. But somewhere along that winding road, the map began to blur. The fall wasn't sudden. It was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like a dimming light, still warm but gradually fading. As the financial pressures mounted, Cage began to say yes to nearly every script offered. It didn't matter if it was theatrical or direct-to-video. Didn't matter if the role was complex or paper-thin. He had bills to pay, castles to maintain, debts to erase. And so, the films began to change. Where once he shared the screen with the likes of Sean Connery or John Travolta, now he found himself in low-budget thrillers with names like Trespass, Seeking Justice, and Left Behind, movies that barely whispered in theaters, if they arrived there at all. Critics were unkind. The public was puzzled. Why, they asked, was Nicolas Cage in so many terrible films? Was it desperation? Or had he simply lost his touch? But those who watched closely, they saw something else. They saw a man still giving everything. Even in the strangest, most obscure roles, Cage brought an intensity that refused to die. Whether he was screaming into the void or quietly unraveling on screen, there was a sense that he was acting for more than just a paycheck. He was acting because it was all he had left. And somewhere in the noise, a cult began to form. People began watching Cage not to mock him, but to witness the madness. To see where he would go next. To marvel at how he could take even the most absurd lines and deliver them with Shakespearean gravity. In Mandy, 2018, a psychedelic revenge horror film, Cage was not just good, he was mesmerizing. And in Pig, 2021, a quiet, mournful film about a man searching for his stolen truffle pig, he delivered what many called the performance of his career. No yelling. No chaos. Just grief, tenderness, and depth. The critics who once dismissed him now leaned in closer. Audiences who had turned away were suddenly whispering again, as if a long-lost artist had returned to his craft. But he had never really left. He had only wandered. He once said, "I never had a career, only work." And perhaps that's the most honest statement of all. Because to Cage, the line between blockbuster and B-movie never really mattered. Every film was a stage, every role a new chance to explore something raw, something strange, something uniquely Cage. And that's the twist, isn't it? In trying to survive, he became something else entirely. Not just a star, but a symbol. A reminder that the road to redemption does not always run uphill. Sometimes it winds through the mud, through the forgotten towns of direct-to-video cinema, through the flickering screens of midnight cult classics, until it finds the light again. He never stopped working, never stopped performing, never disappeared. He just changed course. And in doing so, he became free. And so, the curtain falls. Not with applause, not always with closure, but with a soft and lingering silence. Brendan Fraser, Lindsay Lohan, Mike Tyson, Nicolas Cage, 4 names once spoken with awe and envy. 4 lives that lit up screens in stadiums, red carpets and magazine covers. Each, at some point, crowned with the kind of fame most only dream of. And yet, behind that shine, there were cracks. Fortunes vanished. Careers collapsed. Reputations twisted in the winds of headlines, scandals, and missteps. But perhaps the deeper story, the one we rarely hear, is not about failure. It's about fragility. Because even those who soar the highest are still human. Brendan Fraser taught us that quiet strength doesn't always make the front page. Lindsay Lohan reminded us how fame at the wrong time can warp a soul still forming. Mike Tyson showed the price of invincibility, and what happens when power meets pain. And Nicolas Cage, well, he proved that even legends can burn through treasure in pursuit of something greater than wealth, purpose, escape, or maybe just a second act. These stories don't end with numbers on a bank statement. They end in resilience, or in reflection. And for us, the observers, the ones watching from the safety of distance, maybe they serve as a reminder that no fortune is permanent, that no spotlight is forever, and that sometimes, losing everything, is what it takes to finally find yourself. Thank you for spending your evening with me, wandering through the corridors of fame, fortune, and the quiet collapse behind the curtain. Wherever you are in the world, whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply chasing stillness in the dark, I hope tonight's story left you a little more thoughtful, a little more grounded, and a little more human. Sleep well. And as always, good night.